once the protectorship was established, with Cromwell being the Lord Protector, this became a quasi-democratic military dictatorship. It was paternalistic and it was benign. He never committed atrocities at home. Yes, that's true. There was religious persecution of people who didn't conform. The Anglican churches and the Catholic churches were all desecrated. Not all, but most of them. And their properties stolen and destroyed, and the priests, of course, went into hiding or got out of the country, or some of them were hanged or killed, the Roman and the Anglican priests. Everybody was sort of leveled down to this fundamental kind of Protestantism that prevailed. It wasn't pure Puritanism and it wasn't Presbyterian, but it was sort of in between there. And there was a lot of pressure on the public to conform to it. The sumptuary laws were instituted where you couldn't wear fripperies and jewelry and ribbons and all these things. This was odorous on people with imagination. In 56, Cromwell, in 1656, Cromwell was offered a crown. It was a very pretty crown. But the generals, Ireton, I think the Fairfaxes jumped on him. He said, "My God, Oliver, we're not going to go through this again. We've been fighting for 8 years. You're not going to become king." And he put by the idea of a crown. No, I don't want a crown. But Parliament gave Cromwell the right of succession. That meant his son, or one of his sons, could succeed him. Most of his sons, 2 of his sons were dead in the Civil War. Well, several reasonably positive things occurred under Cromwell. He ended the Dutch War. There was a trade war with Holland, which had been very bad for both countries. Holland was the greatest trading nation on the planet, and England was rapidly approaching a competitive state, and they'd had a war under the previous government ongoing, and he put an end to that. And this was very beneficial for both powers. Then Cromwell turned around and arranged alliances with both, with which England had had trouble, you just heard me delineate a few of these petty little instances of warfare between these countries. And that was eliminated, so that was a plus. He made peace with Mazarin. Richelieu had died, but Mazarin was the same policy as Richelieu. And then the island of Jamaica, which everybody had been grabbing at, and the English occupied it, and it's been British ever since. There was general toleration of religions, except for the Catholics and the Quakers. They were forbidden. The Scots Presbytery was ongoing in its dissatisfaction with the way things had gone, for reasons that you've already heard about. And the nonconformists were not happy because they were more liberal than the Puritans, if you will, but not as, they weren't Anglicans. But they were nonconformists, they were moderates, and they were not happy because they were under pressure to conform to this puritanical kind of attitude that had prevailed in the country since the Civil War ended. One of the big issues was there was an economic depression, and the triggering area of the Greatest Depression was in the luxury trades. You have to realize that when the court and the church, the high church, was in full flower, they absorbed enormous amounts of the economy. The textile trade, the furniture business, the jewelry trade, precious commodities trade, all of the luxury goods, if you will. The church demanded enormous amounts of gold for the ornamentations of the churches. All of those things, the ceremonial activities of these areas, were a big industry. All of those people were out of work. They were not happy, to be sure. And as a result, there was a growing pro-restoration movement afoot. It was beginning to bubble up. Well, in 1658, at the age of 59, Oliver Cromwell died. He'd had a terribly straining existence. He'd been a very robust man, but by the end of the Civil War and his taking over as protector, the strain was getting more and more. And probably his heart gave out. I don't know the exact cause of his death. He had been a just man. He was stern, but he was ignorant, and he was stubborn, and he was bigoted. A very narrow and determined individual, to be sure. But his energy and his drive had forced the nation through this terrible civil war and brought it out with a form of government which had changed England completely, as we'll see. He had hoped for a Protestant union. He had hoped to unite England with the Baltic states, with the German states, and with the Dutch in a Protestant union. That hadn't happened. When he died, his son Richard inherited the Lord Protectorship, as the Parliament had granted him the right of succession. The merchant magnates in London and Birmingham and a couple of other big cities now wanted to revive what had been before the Revolution without all of the consequences that the monarchy brought. So they were beginning to ask for change. 10 years of virtue had been enough for them. They were disenchanted. They wanted change. Well, in 1659, the year after Cromwell's death, the man who had taken over the scene of strongman in England was George Monk. He was now in command of the army as a successor to Cromwell automatically, and Richard was only too happy to hand it over to him. And Monk was looked to by everybody as the next man. What do we do, Monk? What do we do? So he descended on London. He brought his army down into London the next year, 1650, and he dumped out all the bare-bones Parliament people. Now, they had been Cromwell's cronies. They're his men. And Monk installed a pro-royalist Parliament. There were a lot of people who wanted to back the king. So he said, I'm reading his mind as if I could, but it looks as if he felt that that was going to be the pressure and wave for the future, and to go with it would be politically appropriate. And then they began, he and the magnates, the big mercantile bosses, if you will, negotiating with the Prince of Wales, who was in exile in Holland. And they said, if you will agree to a certain list of restrictions, you are invited to come home and be king. This was the Declaration of Breda, because it was signed in Breda. Well, Charles said, of course, gentlemen, of course, whatever, where do I sign? And he immediately signed the declaration. And in the spring of the next year, 1650, Charles returned to England and was proclaimed King Charles II. Now, when he landed at Portsmouth, it looked like all of England was there to meet him. There was such a release of joy and delight that the chilly days of the commonweal were over, and all of the people who had been pushed down and pushed out of sight and had been hiding all of these years were now there in full force to greet him. Oh, it was like the second coming. They dragged his coach by hand from Portsmouth up to London. They were just, overwhelming, nothing like it's ever been seen in England. Well, there were conditions on the monarchy, of course. First of all, he was penniless. He had been living on the dole all these years, good graces of friends, and he was totally dependent on Parliament for money. So that was one restriction. And the military control was under Parliament. Actually, it was under General Monk. So he had no control over the military. He couldn't order the army to do anything. That is the major weapon of any arbitrary government, control of the military. That's why we worry today about how arbitrary relationship has become between the executive and the military. Well, the king still had appointing powers, to be sure. He could give grants and titles and patents to people, and usually they paid for these things, so that was a little income that was coming in. And it also, you were glad to pay for it because it gave you an honor, gave you a position at court, usually, or a title that made you somebody above everybody else. And that's, of course, what we all lust after, isn't it? The Church of England was reestablished. That was that. The Anglican Church, the C of E, the Church of England, was back. And it was imposed with the Act of Uniformity. Everybody was now under the church. That doesn't mean you all had to be an Anglican. That meant if you wanted a job or a position anywhere, you'd better be one. Maybe it was 18 months after he had been crowned, he ordered his officers, which he could do, to round up all of the members of that 40-man court that had executed his father. Well, many of them had fled, and some of them were dead. Now his officers wanted to go after everybody. A lot of his lords were still with him, but they had lost all their manor houses and their properties, all been stolen during the Commonwealth period. They wanted a revenge. He wouldn't let them do it. There were always incidents, but generally speaking, the policy was, no, we're not going to have any more of that. He'd been a teenager in exile, first in France, He joined his mother there and his sister, and of course he took his brother James, and they all lived there for a while, but it became inconvenient. And so he moved alone and then with James, over to Holland, where he stayed until his restoration. And he was in debt to all these people. You know, they all wanted their money back. They'd been paying out for his support, and they wanted their money back, and of course he didn't have it. Charles was a very tolerant man, by and large. Not only was he witty and funny and charming, but he was tolerant. And he tolerated everybody religiously except the Puritans. That's understandable. How could you stomach a Puritan? And of course, these Puritans made another dash for out of the country. Actually, they went to Holland first. You know that. And then they made their way across to blight the American coastline. Charles had been a survivor. He learned from the age of 11 and 12 and 13, and he'd had to flee to Scotland during the Civil War and then across. And he learned to make his way as a survivor. And to survive, you have to dissemble. You tell everybody what they want to hear. You figure out what they want to hear, and that's what you tell them. So he was a dissembler, par excellence. He also was a terrible liar. But anyway, well, his father had lied too. He did it in the goals that he had. His court life, well, here he'd been a young man, restricted and constantly drawn in his exuberance. He was a naturally outgoing man, very garrulous, full of energy, and he'd been pushed down. Well, now it was all let out. And his court was the bawdiest court imaginable. He had all these mistresses. There were at one time 7 mistresses living in the palace with him. He couldn't say no. Well, you know, occasionally they'd fall out of love, and he simply let them stay. You know, they had an apartment, and they went to court, and I remember Barbara Villiers. I don't think that she was connected with George. She was the oldest of the English mistresses. And she was there forever, a middle-aged woman of considerable years at the end. But she stayed on as well as the last comer. The most famous probably is Eleanor Gwynne, Nell to the public. She was 20 when Charles took her on. She was a very popular and successful comedian in Drury Lane, rather inelegant origins, but still in all, she was funny and witty and charming and giddy, and of course it's understandable how any man would fall in love with her. Her appointments were dazzling. And she was a recent comer at his court. And then, of course, there was the famous Louise de Carwall, a French aristocrat whom Charles had met when he was in France, and utterly besotted by her. She was small and willowy and had silvery blonde hair, and she had a slight limp and a lisp. And he was captivated, so she came to England, and he created her the Duchess of Portsmouth. Unfortunately, she was a born aristocrat, so she looked down on all Charles's other mistresses, especially Nell Gwynne. She was so haughty, a very arrogant woman, and out of Charles' sight, of course, all of this took place. And she was always referring to Nell as a little streetwalker. And Nell put up with this for the longest time. But after a year or so, when Nell caught on as to how things worked at court, she let the Duchess of Portsmouth have it. The Duchess would parade through the salon. They all visited all day. What else did they do? They walked around and talked and ate and so on. And as Louise left the room with her friends, there was laughter in the room. What was going on in there they didn't know about. So finally, she couldn't stand it. She went back and she looked in. Well, there was Nell Gwynne loping around the room, pretending to limp, you know, like Quasimodo, and lisping and drooling and carrying on and putting on a terrible charade of Louise de Carwall, the Duchess of Portsmouth. And of course, the court was hysterical with laughter. They all hated Louise. Well, after that, Louise left her alone. Mistresses or bawdy court or not, Charles, immediately on arriving in England, was faced with the idea of getting married. He had to get married and get the line started. And arrangements were made for him to marry the Infanta of Portugal, a Catholic princess, of course. Oh God, here we go again. But anyway, Catherine de Berganza. She was a sweet little thing, very dark, very small. She had lived like a nun all of her life. She'd never seen any men except her father, her priest, and her brothers. Totally closeted in the Escorial in Spain. And she had been selected, and she came to England. She fell in love with her husband, which is always fatal. Royal marriages, that's not an issue, you know, it's not important. And she fell in love with Charles, but Charles appointed all of his mistresses as her ladies-in-waiting. And she was, well, her affection for him and his affection for her prevailed over these awkward moments. Eventually, because she never bore any children, Charles was pushed very hard to divorce her on the basis of her inability to bear children and remarry. But he said, well, I wouldn't think of it. It would hurt her feelings. I don't want to hear another word about this. And he never was anything but kind and affectionate toward her. So, for what that's worth. In the summer of 1664, the ships from the Black Sea docked at Portsmouth. They had travelers on board who would be very unwelcome. These travelers were carrying baggage with them that nobody wanted. The travelers came down the ropes tying the ships to the dock. They were the rats, and the rats were infested with the fleas carrying the bubonic plague. The plague began to break out that summer, and it spread quickly, of course. It was hot, it was overcrowded, the people were poor, there was no sanitation. People began to die. Everybody that left that part of the city carried the fleas with them, because we never bathed, you know. Bathing once a year if you were lucky. So the fleas were in our hair and our clothing, and everything was crawling. And the plague began to spread through the city. People were dying faster than they could be buried. The churchyards filled up immediately. They dug great pits in the outskirts and hauled the bodies out at night. Some of the houses, people just didn't come out anymore, and they were boarded up. You could hear them moaning inside. They were still alive, but they were sick, and you simply bricked up the doors. You didn't want to hear about it. Your neighbors you didn't go near. You carried a cloth over your face. All the rich and the well-to-do, of course, left town. We weren't going to stick around and let the hoi polloi infect us, after all. The royal family moved out to Richmond, for the air was better, but the plague kept spreading. It was awful. Well, the stench of rot and filth. But in the early fall of '66, this was 18 months into the plague, a baker's stove on Pudding Lane, unattended, maybe the attendees had died of the plague, broke, and the stove spilled out and caught fire to the room. And the room went into flame, the building began to burn, the building caught to the next, and pretty soon the whole block of buildings was flaming. It's been this dry summer, and not any rain for months. The thatched roofs caught, they just exploded. And pretty soon the city was a raging inferno, and nearly a quarter of the city was in flames. Well, the royals came back into town. Charles and his brother James, they rode in immediately with many young men of the court, and they began to organize something to get the people out and to stop the Holocaust from happening. And they began blowing up the buildings. They circled the fire several blocks away from where the fire was burning out, and put powder under the buildings and knocked them down so the fire wouldn't jump the break. And eventually the fire was brought under control, but a good third of London had been incinerated, including the central part of the city, the major part, including the cathedral. However, of course, as you know, this gave the government, Charles's government, an opportunity to rebuild that part of London, which is spread into the center of the city. The cathedral, St. Paul's, had been burned down, and so a large part of the municipal center had been destroyed, and now they could rebuild it. It was all cleared out. Everybody that lived there got to clear out things, unlike they're doing in New Orleans. And they began to rebuild the public buildings. And St. Paul's Cathedral, of course, Christopher Wren and other architects had their great moment in history. And these buildings, of course, are the major features of central London today. So that was a kind of plus after a tragedy. Charles, as I say, was always in debt and always looking for cash. And in 1670, his cousin Louis XIV, who was now beginning a campaign to destroy the Netherlands, simply because they didn't want the competition with France. France was a growing economic power. Louis wanted to make it a better one. If they could destroy the Dutch and co-opt their trade, this would be a plus for France, and that was the object that Louis was after. Well, of course, the Dutch didn't want that to happen. And the Dutch had formed, during Cromwell's time, an alliance with England. Remember? Very important. England was going to go to the aid of the Dutch if something happened to them. Well, Louis knew all this, and he knew that Charles was broke. So he communicated with his cousin, saying, in effect, if you can prevent the British Parliament from going to the aid of the Dutch while I attack the Dutch, for every year you can do this, I will pay you, Charles, 150,000 pounds sterling. Well, that's not to be sneezed at, my children. And Louis went on to say, I want you to reconvert to the true church. I know you're a Catholic, Charlie, so don't argue with me. And then work to convert all of England back to the true church. And Charles said, of course, glad to. Anything you say, Louis, bring on the gold. Well, this was negotiated by none other than Charles's sister, Henrietta Maria. Now, his mother was named that too. They named the girl then. Whom in the family we refer to as Minette, so that's what I'm going to call her. She had married Louis XIV's brother. She was the Duchess of Orleans. So she was the one going back and forth across the channel with the money and the contracts and the agreements and the letters and the business. This worked fine for a couple of years. The loot came in, Louis's war with the Dutch was unimpeded, and then somebody broke the news of what we call the secret Treaty of Dover. That's what this was called. And when this spilled into the newspapers, Charles' credibility with the House of Commons was virtually ruined. And it loosed a hysterical attack on the French throughout England. Everything French. Shops, people, travelers, whomever, all under attack. One of the favorite objects, of course, became that unpopular mistress of the king, Louise de Carwall, the Duchess of Portsmouth. Well, Charles was so unpopular at this period, he didn't feel comfortable calling his parliament. They'd throw rocks at him. The public would, not the parliament. And so he had to call parliament every 3 years. By the way, that was one of the agreements the king had to agree to after the revolution. So he called his next parliament at Oxford. The parliament went out there, and then he would go out there and call it into session. Well, the rioters in London knew this. The ringleaders of the most the most violent people, they knew what was going on. And so they said, well, if he's going to do that, of course, everybody will go out there. Now, when the king traveled, he went in a series of coaches. He and the Queen traveled in their coach, and then the Duke and Duchess of York traveled in theirs right behind, and so on, the Queen Mother maybe, and so on. And then came all the royal mistresses in their individual coaches according to their tenure in office. And the mob knew all this. Now, they were going to humiliate the king by attacking the Duchess of Portsmouth. So they arranged to get out to Oxford. Oxford was a walled city then. Everybody had to go through the gate. So as the coaches went through the gate, they were going to attack the Duchess of Portsmouth, throw her out of her carriage, and God knows do what to her, virtually in front of the king. That was the plan, so that's what they did. Well, here came the coaches on the day. The king passed the Duke of York, one magnificent coach after another, and the mob was waiting. Oh, that must be it. No, that's not it. That's it, that's it, that's it. Everybody after that one. And they went after this magnificent carriage approaching, and they unhitched the horses, and they began to rock the big vehicle back and forth. They were going to turn it over, of course. Well, it was Nell Gwynne's coach they had mistaken for the Duchess of Portsmouth. She was rattling around inside. Finally, she got the window down, and she leaned out and said, "Pray, good people, be civil. I am not she, I am the Protestant whore." Well, everybody loved Nell Gwynne, so the rest of her trip was made in dignity. Well, this business with the French and the Catholics and the Dover thing, it was all getting to a battle over the succession now. Charles hadn't had any children, legitimately. And his brother, the Duke of York, was the next in line. Now, the Duke of York, James, was a devout and open Catholic. No question about it. And the people in the parliament did not want a Catholic sovereign. After all, what are we even talking about? So they evolved what was called the Test Act, which prevented anybody who was Catholic from holding any kind of government job. Well, James, obviously he was part of the government, virtually, and they wanted to get him out of the line of succession. They were going to ban him from the... Charles was furious about all of this, just furious. He was helpless to really do anything about it. He allowed the pressures of the time to banish James to Scotland. He went to get away from the agitation in London. They were going to impeach him for being a Catholic, I guess. The result of all of this hugger-mugger was the development of, for the first time in English history, political parties. And we see the Whigs and the Tories. You've all heard of these things. The Whigs were anti-James. They were anti-royalist, anti-establishment, a lot of them. And the Tories were pro-royalist. They were certainly supporters of James. And the Whigs and Tories went on being a major political element down into the end of the 19th century. And today, when the Labour Party on the left, as you face the chair, wants to insult the opposition party, they refer to them as Tories, meaning old reactionary fuddy-duddies. So it's a relevant name in the history of England. Well, Charles dissolved the Parliament of the time in 81, and he was hoping that that would be the end of it. But of course, he had to keep calling parliaments every 3 years, so eventually it came up again. While he and his brother James were traveling to and from one of these parliaments, they were supposed to stay at a place called Rye House. It was just a place to stay, a big country house. On the day that they were supposed to be there, somebody had filled it with gunpowder and blew it up, hoping to kill the king and his brother. Well, they weren't there, fortunately for them. They were traveling a different route. The terrorists, as we call them today, were frustrated, but the king was horrified. This was a close call, and it turned him utterly reactionary. He said there were never going to be another parliament as long as I live. Well, that didn't matter much because he died in 2 years. Charles II was only 55, I think, when he died. He had been a sportsman in more ways than one. He was a great tennis player, golfer, rode prodigiously, not hunting, but riding. Loved to walk. He took his spaniels, the famous Blenheim spaniels, that were all over us, great swarm of these little dogs. Everywhere you went, you had to be careful not to step on the king's dogs. If you did, you got a whack by the king's cane. Charles was a very energetic and active man. He probably would not have died of a stroke if the doctors hadn't been called in. But with their glisters, bleedings, and purgings, they finished him off. He said, I'm so long to be a-dying, I regret it. On his deathbed, his brother was holding his hand, and he said, Charles, do you want to see a priest? And Charles answered, yes. Well, James had a priest out in the corridor waiting in case. Priest was brought in. King confessed, was absolved, and given extreme unction. He had converted and was a Catholic when he died. His last words were actually to James, Jimmy, don't let Nellie starve. Well, James did not let Nell starve, to be sure. The legacy left behind by this king was an expanding colonial system, the West Indies, the North America, so on. Arts and sciences flourished during his... He was an amateur scientist. He had a laboratory and worked there all the time. And of course, the Royal Society was founded during Charles II's reign with his patronage. The new city of London, which was just the beginning because succeeding reigns would amplify it to much of what you see today. And of course, the rise of political parties, it was something that the Stuarts had a horror of, the Whigs and the Tories business, and a stronger Commons. And this they didn't like either, of course. The Crown was much weaker than it ever had been. There's hardly any comparison to the prerogatives that Charles had compared to what his father had had and lost. But he had had no children. Now, what's to be happening? Is there going to be a succession battle? Are we going to have another civil war? What? Well, I'll tell you. James II, his brother, he succeeded to the crown. Everybody said, oh my God, what'll happen next? But the coronation went off without incident. Nobody lifted a finger. Nothing happened. James II was 52. He was courageous, immoral, and inept. He distinguished himself in public service in the Navy. He was a very good sailor, and he did well as head of the Navy. Everybody liked him. He'd been banished to satisfy the anti-Catholics, and that embittered him toward his subjects. He'd married twice. He married first a Protestant woman, Anne Hyde. Her father was a major figure in Charles II's Restoration government. And Anne Hyde had borne 2 daughters, Mary and Anne, and we'll hear about them. But Anne Hyde died, and the widowed James married immediately a princess, Mary of Modena, a Catholic princess. Here we go again. Well, no sooner had James become king than there was a rebellion against him led by the Duke of Monmouth. Well, who in the heck is the Duke of Monmouth, you ask? Well, back before time, when Charles was not Charles II, but Charles in exile in Holland, he had had a long relationship with Lucy Walters, who had borne him a son. Well, when Charles became king, he invited the son to come live at his court, created him Duke of Monmouth, his bastard son. The Duke of Monmouth thought that he should be king. After all, he was the son of Charles II, bar sinister or no. Well, of course, James said you aren't. And they went into a battle over it, and the royal army led by James put an end to the Duke of Monmouth and all his followers. They were all put to death. There was a set of assizes set up all over England where judges tried the miscreants in this rebellion. Hanging Judge Jeffreys did away with 1,000 men who were implicated in this rebellion. Oh, very efficient then. Well, then now the fears of many were manifest when King James began to appoint Catholics to high office. And then he invited the papal legate to come to England. There hadn't been a papal legate in England since Mary Tudor's time before Elizabeth. So this was panic time in Parliament. James was obviously reconverting England to Rome because many churches now were dumping out their Anglican ministers and putting in Catholic priests. And then in 1688, his second wife, Mary of Modena, gave birth to their first and only child, a son whom they named James Edward Stuart, and baptized him a Catholic. That broke the terrible building effort to do something about it, and the opposition movement burst into the open. Across over the channel into the Netherlands was William, Prince of Orange, ruler of the Dutch states, and he saw this as an opportunity. He wanted England to come in and help him stop Louis XIV. If he would go over, he thought, and put an end to James II, who was his father-in-law because he'd married James's daughter Mary. Are you keeping track? If he put an end to James II, Parliament would make him king. So he led an army across the channel. He was encouraged to do this by the magnates in London who wanted to get rid of James. James formed an army and went out to meet him. James' army went over to William. Abandoned the king. James fled, was captured. Worse, embarrassing. Well, now William was in charge of the country with the English Parliament behind him. But what to do about James? They didn't want to capture him. They wanted him to escape. And some idiot had arrested him. Well, they said, well, put him in a house down on Dover coast where he could see France and open the window. And in a few days, James had vanished to France. What a relief. Well, now, the odd part about it is William of Orange wanted to be king, but the Parliament didn't really want him as king. But he had this wife, Mary, very popular princess. She was Mary Stuart, James's daughter, and a Protestant. William and Mary both were Protestants. So they decided, all right, we will make you joint rulers for life. William III, Mary II. And that's the way it worked out. This was called the Glorious Revolution. No blood was spilt. Well, I think there was some blood spilt, but not enough to warrant it to be a bloody revolution. William wanted the army to go help him with the French. Louis XIV realized this, of course. He was watching what was going on. He was waging his wars in Europe, and he thought, well, we will have to divert these imbecilic English away from my efforts in the Netherlands. So I will take my cousin James, who is now here living with me, and put him at the head of French troops, send him over to Ireland, and attack England from Ireland. And this will keep William occupied. And that's what they did. And in 1690, war broke out in Ireland when William, not waiting for much, managed to develop a quick army from England, because the English were worried about this. They didn't want this to happen. And over across the Irish Sea he went and made war on the French-Irish for some months. But it culminated on the River Boyne when William and James and their armies met. And it was a catastrophe for the Irish. The Franco-Irish efforts were overwhelmed completely. James fled back to France, and that was the end of him. And the Irish were decimated. Now, the interesting aspect of that is that every year today, the members of the Orange Party march in the Catholic districts. The Orange Party represent William of Orange, Protestant, and they march in the Catholic districts, especially in Northern Ireland, that's the only place they're doing it, and rioting breaks out every year. The Irish Catholics and the Irish Protestants have a good old go at it. All goes back to the River Boyne. The Battle of the Boyne, 1690. Well, William went back to England immediately and tried to negotiate with the members of Parliament, the Whigs and the Tories, to get them to help him. And of course, this is what the king is supposed to do. So he alienated both factions. He did lead some troops over there, and from time to time he did go over to Europe and fight the French with English help, but not much. And it was with mixed results. It wasn't getting anywhere. And then in 1694, Queen Mary died, and with her went much of William's popularity. But a couple of years later, you wouldn't believe what happened. In 1701, Louis XIV's grandson was announced to be the new King of Spain, Philip V. And that meant that not only would the European allies and the English have to face France, but now they would have to face the combined efforts of France and the Spanish Empire. This turned England, finally. We have got to stop the Franco-Spanish effort. And they threw themselves completely into the war against France. Well, William was seeing at last his hopes come to life, and a resolution to the problem of Holland may be at hand. He was involved up to his ears in this, and he was exhausted from the effort. So with now the war effort moving in the direction he'd worked for, he took a few days' rest. And while he was riding his horse in the country, his horse stepped in a molehill, stumbled, threw the king. William broke his collarbone. The collarbone wound became septic, and in a week, William was dead. He was only 52. He was the hardest working, most able of the whole crew of Stuarts, and he wasn't even a Stuart. But he was a man of principle, and that, of course, set him aside from most Stuarts. And he was determined, but he was dead. His enemies went on for years drinking a toast to the little man in the black velvet suit. They were referring to the mole. With the death of William and the passing prematurely of his wife Mary, that brought Mary's sister to the throne, Anne. The Anne Hyde, 2 daughters, remember? Well, Anne was 37 when she ascended. She had been torn in her loyalties between her father and her sister and brother-in-law, of course. And it nearly killed her, but she abandoned her father, James, and supported her brother William and her sister Mary in the Glorious Revolution, brought them to power. They didn't seem to find much, they didn't respect her particularly for this. She had married a Danish prince, Prince George, and they had had a good family life, but unfortunately, of her 14 pregnancies, not one of her children survived. And it ruined her health, of course. Her husband had fought for William, and William had snubbed him, and this was hard to take. So it was not a happy life for Anne. And then, of course, after 6 years of being queen, her husband died of cancer, and this was awfully difficult. She was a pretty miserable person. At the age of 43, there was Anne, fat, 40, and alone. Rather sad. Well, she wasn't really alone. Now, when she was simply Anne Hyde, she had grown up with Sarah Jennings. They'd been girls together, you know, and grown up at school. But Anne was a slow, rather plump, phlegmatic woman, liked peace and quiet and comfort, and was politically rather reactionary. But Sarah was tall and blonde and handsome and elegant and full of, her mouth never stopped. She was very political, and she favored the Whigs, where Anne favored the Tories. And of course, because they were so close and they bonded, and Anne sort of let her drag her around and push her into shape. And Sarah nagged the daylights out of her. Oh, come on, get up, stop. You've got to, but you're a... Well, this went on and on and on. Well, after Anne became queen, and she didn't want to hear any more about it. But there was John. Now, John was a phenomenon in more ways than one, lady. He had made his advent to society in Charles II's court by having a relationship with the Duchess of Cleveland. This is Charles's first mistress, when he was 20 and she was 30 or 5 or 40. And he was so amazing that she introduced him round to certain people who could make his career for him, and it was in the military. And his rise in the military was as phenomenal as in the bedstead. It was totally incredible. He was a military genius, as Cromwell had been, although I think John Churchill had real training in it. He had served under James II when James became king, but during the Glorious Revolution, he deserted James, went over to William. William never trusted him, but he used him. And then when Anne became queen, she appointed him commander of all the armies, and then created him the Duke of Marlborough. And that's how we know him. So Sarah and John are the Duke and Duchess of Marlborough. Between 1702 and 76, under his command of the Allied forces and English armies, he led them to one victory after another over the French. In Blenheim, the most famous, in Ramley, in Oudenarde, in Malplaquet, these were all huge victories for the English and the Allies. French defeats. And as a result, the Duke of Marlborough became a national hero. Parliament acclaimed him as such, voted him an enormous pension, with which he was to build himself a monumental house, which is called Blenheim Palace, and I'm glad you know about it. You should all visit it when you're in England. It's stupendous, outside of Oxford there. Well, with Anne wanting to be out of the relationship with Sarah, it was difficult because John was so important to the war effort. But by 1710, she couldn't take it anymore, and she dismissed the Duchess of Marlborough. The next year, interestingly enough, the Duke of Marlborough was relieved by Parliament of his command. He was charged with the embezzlement of public funds. Now, John was a hero, but he was unscrupulous, he was ambitious, and he was avaricious, and it had gotten to him. Well, that may be. The following year, the French had their backs to the wall. Louis XIV, he had spent his country into ruin, his people were starving, the Allies had forced him back behind his own borders, France had lost everything he'd gained over a 30-year period. The Allies were threatening to invade on the morrow. He'd melted down all the Versailles furniture, which was made of sterling silver, to pay off the troops, and everything was ruins. Well, as it turns out, the Allies did not want to overrun France. They were exhausted. They wanted to stop it too. So a truce, followed by the Treaty of Utrecht, was signed, and the end of the War of the Spanish Succession. And there was Anne, free at last, No more nagging. She had now Mrs. Masham, sweet Abigail Masham, who was a comforting person, a little bit older than Anne, and she knew how to make Anne comfortable. Now, dear, you just sit there quiet. I'm going to bring you a nice cup of tea. That's what you need. Yes, dear, thank you. That's all Queen wanted. She didn't realize Mrs. Masham was doing politics behind her back, but that's the story again. The Queen was ill. She was a recluse. She didn't want any more to do with her cabinet. Oh, don't bother me with this. The cabinet was ruling the country. One day somebody said when there was a signature needed, well, we need the Queen's signature. She has to read this. Somebody said, oh, for God's sake, shut up. The Queen is as dead as Julius Caesar. Get on with it. Sign the name. That's the way it was going. She was not relevant. Her final action had to be hers, and that was to sign the Act of Succession. Now, the Act of Succession actually came in 1701, but she hadn't signed it all this time. And that was to sign her name to agree to the line of succession going to the House of Hanover. And she didn't want any part of that. Now, her relative was in that line. It all came from her great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather here. But she couldn't stand the idea of one of those damn Germans coming to England. So she wouldn't sign it. Well, finally she signed it. That was the last act. Her last appearance was opening the House of Parliament in 1714. She was so crippled with gout, they had to carry her in that chair. She was hugely overweight, a lot of edema, very painful. Erysipelas had marred her face. She had to wear a false wig so that she would learn makeup and all the rest of it to look human. But she read her own speech, and she had a beautiful, melodious voice. Everybody thought it was a beautifully read speech. But the last time they saw her, a few weeks later, her maid was dressing her for the night, and the Queen was standing. She was holding onto the mantelpiece, looking into the mirror, terrible expression on her face. Her maid said, oh, madam, what do you see? I see a dying look. And a few days later, she was dead. She was only 49. Well, the legacy of all of this, there was now a union of Scotland and England that had taken place, bringing about the United Kingdom that we all know, that had taken place in the years before. She was the last monarch to use the royal veto. That ended. Her age had been an age of literary and artistic brilliance over which she was unsuited to preside. England was on her way to empire, no question about that. The Stuarts had been just what England needed. They were pro-French, they were pro-Catholic, they believed in the divine right of their authority. They were the greatest inducement imaginable to develop the constitutional monarchy that England would have. I hope you'll join us next month when we hear about the Hanovers.